Hello. This is another series in the line of waffles about paganism. With me, still in the kitchen, still baking. This time it's a sultana cake to take on a picnic, because tomorrow, along with several friends, I'm going to an historical reenactment fair. Not to dress up and play a part or do anything, tell stories, what have you. Just going as a punter. So we're just going there to have a nice time, watch the displays, listen to other people telling stories, and spend far too much money and have a picnic, all the usual things. It's prompted the thought that this would be something worth reflecting on, the issue of historical reenactment. It's an accusation that I've heard on quite a number of occasions made by both pagans and non-pagans, that paganism in the 21st century and 20th century, modern day paganism, is somewhat prone to looking like a historical reenactment fair. Certainly if you go to a large scale event where there's rituals taking place and that kind of thing, big conferences and fairs and camps and what have you, you can easily see people dressed up in clothing that would not be wholly out of place at a historical reenactment fair. Styles of clothing that perhaps lend themselves to a sort of ye olde Merlin Morgana look. Not historically accurate styles of clothing necessarily, all of them, sometimes they are, but not necessarily. But clothing that has a kind of look of the past about it, if you can put it like that. And in certain parts of the world, not so much over here, but in some parts of the world, it's not uncommon for pagans in a position of leadership, where they're leading covens and groves and what have you, to take on board aristocratic titles, call themselves Lord this and Lady that. And again, it has this sort of Renaissance fair vibe to it. Some people, so pagan and non-pagan alike, have suggested that this is a sort of, it's an escapism, and it's a romanticisation. Romanticisation because the past isn't necessarily the golden age that a lot of us would like to think it is. So it's not an uncommon notion that the modern world, both the 20th and 21st century, are overcast by the fears and worries of excessive technology and environmental destruction. That kind of what William Blake called the dark satanic mills looming over people, as they see more and more and more of the wild environment being ploughed under and concreted over, and cities expanding, factories getting bigger and bigger, and it gets harder and harder to breathe fresh air that isn't polluted up to the eyeballs. More and more people spend an awful lot of time, exactly as I'm doing right at this moment, so I'm aware of the irony of that, talking to machines and computers rather than directly face-to-face with other human beings. Are we heading into some kind of dystopian future? Many people worry, and plenty worry that we're actually in a dystopian present with a future. And so they look to other periods of history, and they think that in previous millennia people were closer to nature, they spoke face to face rather than just doing this with a mobile phone or a tablet, whatever, all day long. Well, that part of it is obviously certainly true. Whether people in ancient times were greener, more ecological, more in tune with the land, that's you can certainly debate. And obviously in rural farming communities, if you farm the land, well, you've got to be in tune with the seasons. That's especially the further back in history we go, when the technology gets simpler and simpler, more and more of it is done by hand rather than by massive, great satellite coordinated combine harvesters or anything like that. Obviously in the past it was all people with the scythes and casting the seeds by hand and the rest of it. That said, you can also easily find examples of things like the Roman arenas, where vast numbers of wild animals from Europe, from Africa and so forth were captured and taken to perform in the arenas, and the performance being that they would either attack humans, both gladiators and criminals and so on, thrown into the arena, but also to attack each other. And quite horrific levels of blood sports took place. Wide-scale hunting to the point of some species being driven to the very edge in their native environments took place. All sorts of problems occurred in the ancient world. Over-farming, examples of vast numbers of buffalo being driven off cliffs to, even though the people driving them could only eat a very small fraction of the amount of carcasses created. So there are plenty of examples of ancient pagans engaging in bad environmental practice. So that's not just some kind of modern day phenomena. It's something that's been there for quite some time. You could argue it's perhaps symptomatic of human nature generally, that we, whatever period of history we're in, we tend to do fairly dreadful things, not value our environment as much as we should do, and soil our own nests, if you like. And treat each other badly, of course. I mean, slavery and abuses of women by institutionalised abuses of women by men, and maltreatment rather of children. All sorts of quite gruesome things can be found in earlier periods of history, as well as in the current world. So turning to the past doesn't actually give you this golden age, unless the period of past you want to turn to is so far back there is no recorded record at all. Just a few scraps of pottery and bone and things like the Venus of Willendorf and so forth, whereupon you can fantasize almost any kind of glorious style of culture that you want, because there is no written record to prove otherwise, which some pagans do. Revert to this kind of mythical past. And that perhaps is the key word to bear in mind here, that what we're looking at is less objective historical record, it's less logos and more mythos. And the purpose, or one of the purposes of mythos, of sacred story, is to inspire. It's not so much about giving you a series of dry facts. He did this to him, she did that to her, this happened on this date in this place, so on and so forth, the way we tend to perceive history in modern times. Rather, it is to give a story, an account of our people, what we're like, what those other bunch up the road are like, why the world is the way it is. And part of that is bonding, creating a sense of shared identity, a shared story, and it's a story rather than history in the modern day sense of the word. But it's also, if you like, to inspire people on how to behave in the present, how to move forward into the future. This is what is possible. Sometimes it's a sort of grim warnings from history. These are awful things that used to happen once and should never happen again. So perhaps when ancient Irish people through into the Middle Ages, when monks were still writing and people were telling the stories of the Book of Ireland, things like that, where you've got accounts of horrendous battles and how Brez the Beautiful, one of the vainglorious, one of the vainglorious kings of the Tuatha De Danann, who is also half Fomorian, and the Fomori are the horrible monsters who crawl out of the sea and do dreadful things. So this king, who is a sort of halfway between both camps, comes to power and he imposes poll taxes, in effect, huge extortionate taxes upon the people of Ireland, and tries to change the sorts of work they do. And Ofsted, take note, tries to get people jumping through hoops, doing things they're not suited at, rather than doing the things that come as natural callings to their soul. And after putting up with this for a little bit, the gods, the people of Ireland at the time, they rebel, and there's a huge war, and the oppressive forces are driven back, and Brez finds himself booted unceremoniously off of his throne, and there's blood and guts and war everywhere by the end of the battle, as there always is. And people are driven away, and things go back to the good old days. And the point of this is not that this is history in the way we think of history today, that these are actual events that actually happened. Rather, this is a warning, if you like. This is saying, this is how not to govern, because when you get people in authority who behave like this, the end result is that society goes to hell in the handbasket and war will ensue. So it's a kind of a finger-wagging exercise. It's saying, don't do this, people. This is what to avoid doing. And by implication, it also goes on to give evidence of good leadership, good kingship, people who do it right. And again, the purpose of that isn't necessarily that every single event happened in those stories precisely the way it's described as happening, but rather that these stories are there to inspire people on how to lead, how to act, how to move forward in society. So we can, being a bit more charitable, take the approach. God, I'm putting on weight. Take the approach that when pagans are turning to stories of the pagan past, some of which may be rather whimsical at times, some of which may be rather less than rigidly accurate, what they're doing is not so much looking for logos, looking for facts and details and actual events, actual occurrences. They're looking rather for mythos, for a story to inspire them. But sometimes, unfortunately, they confuse the two, and that is very annoying if you are in the business of being a professional historian or whatever. When people can't tell the difference between mythos and logos, and your career is built out of explaining the difference between mythos and logos. Is the recreation of this mythos, when people put on, sort of vaguely historical-looking robes to walk around in for their ceremonies, and referred to each other in a slightly archaic, ye olde worldy style fashion, is this role-playing? Is it acting out a drama which has no bearing on reality? Or is it inspiration? Or is it escapist fantasy? Or is it something else entirely? Well, obviously, I think the answer to that is going to depend on who you're looking at in any given circumstances. You can't make sort of huge, broad, sweeping statements that it's always this or it's always that, because it's going to vary. However, for some people, it may well be escapist fantasy, in the same way that when I turn on Doctor Who, or well, at the moment put on a DVD because it's not running currently, it's giving me, for an hour or two, an escape from my daily life. I can live in this mad fantasy world of weird aliens and time travel and telephone boxes and the rest of it, and I do find it inspirational. It gives me ideas and thoughts and takes my brain off into strange places. But then I come back to daily reality. But I come back with added ideas, added thoughts, notions, maybe feeling a little more relaxed, a little happier, a little more cheerful, or what have you, than I did beforehand. Which is why I do it. The same reason I like reading no end of novels, because they take me into other places. And for a little while my brain is somewhere else, and when it comes back slightly different, with new ideas and new thoughts and so forth. And perhaps it is, I do come back more relaxed and what have you. So I suppose for some people this is almost like you could say a demarcation issue. Very few people, I think, realistically, are going to massively object to other people taking pleasure in fantasy. If somebody likes watching their favourite TV show, or watching a movie, or going to the theatre, or reading a novel, or whatever, only the most sour-faced of miseries is likely to object to that. However, there is this notion that fantasy has to be, shall we say, controlled. That so long as what you are doing is officially entertainment, like a TV show or a novel, then it's okay. If that form of escapism tips over into religion, then for some people that is problematic. So what they want is religion to be true with a capital T, not to have an element of escapism about it. I think if we look across different cultures and we look back in time, actually a lot of religions have an element of escapism about it. Storytelling is central to pretty much all religions. There will be times when, whether it's the priest, the rabbi, the druid, the old lady next door, whoever sits down and tells stories connected to the gods, the Messiah, the whatever the figures of the religion may be, and people, be they children or be they other adults, sit and listen. Christians go and see a mummers play, or you could argue hymn singing is a form of escapism. It is both entertainment in a sense, in that it is listening to music, and therefore it is on a spectrum with things like going to a concert. But it's also a form of reverence, and the one does not preclude the other. That you can engage in both simultaneously. Obviously, perhaps there are some behaviours that might be perfectly acceptable in an overt form of fantasy entertainment that wouldn't go down desperately well in a religious context, and vice versa. So I'm not arguing that it's a completely interchangeable area, but there is an overlap. And certainly within paganism, maybe that overlap is perhaps more obvious than it is in some other religious movements that tend not to think of themselves as entertainments quite so much. Maybe possibly because the pagan revival is still fairly new, possibly because the kind of people who are drawn to it, maybe various other factors we could take into account. We don't always take ourselves that desperately seriously. So maybe pagans on the whole are more willing to go with a bit of fun and a bit of mirth and merriment than perhaps you would expect to find in some other religions at any rate. So it's what I'd like to suggest is maybe a question of self-awareness. If you know you are engaging in fantasy and that fantasy uplifts you, then you are in control of what you're doing. You are aware and conscious of what you're doing. If you get to the point where you've forgotten that what you are doing is a bit of entertainment, a bit of fantasy escape, and you start taking yourself too seriously, maybe that's when you start getting problems, and you start getting people who can't quite tell the difference between fantasized but inspiring mythos history and logos, this definitely did happen in this way, history. Undoubtedly there are some people who get very, very het up about these things, and it becomes very unhelpful for them and for others. But it doesn't have to be that way. It doesn't have to go down that route. And I think as long as you are aware of what you're doing, that's perhaps the key to this. So that if you do put on a slightly Merlin or Morgana style robe and you flounce around for an hour or two, so long as you know this is not an actual hardline historical recreation of something that your great grandparents did, then you're okay. Once you get to the point where you actually think this is the real historical deal, and that what you're doing has this enormous weight to it of history, then you are likely to get a bit up yourself, and perhaps start getting carried away in other areas. If you treat it as mythos, this is an inspiration of what you wish the past had been like, and also, and this is, I think, perhaps an important issue, what you would like the the present and ongoing future to be like, then you remain in a degree of charge of it, and you take a greater benefit from it, because that future orientation, saying, let's say, we'll talk about the role of women in society for argument's sake. You might struggle to find huge amounts of evidence or highly liberated women widespread in the ancient world. You can find plenty of examples of women being badly treated in the distant past, just as they were in the more recent past. If you go back into this kind of, there was ancient Amazonian society and everything was absolutely perfect, and that's what we've got to go back to, and you treat it as logos. This was an absolutely different reality, and get terribly upset if anyone suggests otherwise. Then you're kind of missing the point, I think, slightly. Because that kind of idea of, could we have a society like this, maybe something a bit like this once existed, but even if it was only a little bit like that, we can still use that sort of visionary element to try and change the present and create the future. That's kind of what the mythos is for. It's there to inspire you to rework the world. So even if you look back at the distant history of whichever part of the world you're from, and you find that your pagan ancestors slashed and burned forests and hunted animals until there was hardly any of them left, and did all sorts of crappy, awful things, that might dishearten you. But if you have this idea in your head, maybe that some of them at least loved nature and embraced nature, and it was all much more positive and much more ecological, and you take that mythos idea of what some people may have been like, and you use it to transform the world you live in today, that's when you're kind of getting the gist of what needs to be done. Because it's not about retreating into a fantasy of the past, it's about being very present and real in the present and the foreseeable future, to transform and change the world. There's nothing wrong in dressing up in slightly eccentric clothing and flouncing around. Everyone most people like a good flounce every now and then. There's nothing wrong with wishing the distant past was perhaps an awful lot nicer than it actually was. Having a realistic idea of the grim things that went on in the past is useful, because you can make sure they don't happen again. And you can accept that maybe the theologies of the past were sometimes a little limited, in that if they saw no great problem with those sorts of issues happening, then perhaps there was room for improvement. Maybe, well, that's a very teachery thing to say, isn't it? And you can take that room for improvement and work it into your present day theology. So if it turns out that the style of paganism you're drawn to once condoned slavery, pretty much all did at some point, then you can think to yourself, well, why should they not have condoned slavery? What is objectionable about slavery? Well, this, and this. And then those concepts you work into your present theology, not to try and argue that it absolutely definitely is a theology that dates back umpty thousand years and can be traced back to this, that, or the other great philosopher of the distant past. But you understand that even the great philosophers of the distant past didn't know everything. They got some things wrong, or stuff they were totally unaware of, or didn't even occur to them to think about in the first place. And that we can add to the good stuff that they had, we can add more good stuff of the present, because we now think of the world in a different way than the way they did. And some of what they got wrong we can get right, and some of what we're getting wrong now maybe they did get right back then, and so we can have the best of then and the best of now and merge them together to create a more positive way forward. So you don't have to mindlessly recreate the past, and I think maybe that is also part of the criticism that comes from those people who are not comfortable with the glamorizing of the past that sometimes goes on in pagan circles. Because they may feel as if people are wanting to recreate the past, warts and all, without having a realistic awareness of those warts being there. And that would be a naive thing to do, to go back to a kind of, the full-on grim bits of the ancient past, as well as the positive bits. By all means, recreate the positive things of the past, but no one, well, you don't hope. Not many people would want to recreate the unpleasant bits of the past, but they'd have a sort of enough self-awareness to realise that no period in history is perfect, and therefore you have to be selective about what you bring from the past forward into the present. But perhaps that's more than enough uncoordinated waffle about this relationship between the logos of the past, the objective historical measuring of the past, and the mythos of the past. The kind of slightly idealised, romanticised, inspiring blueprint for what the present and the future could be. Thank you.